The weight of the air here is a thick shroud heavy with the scent of dried river mud and the stale metallic tang of unwashed armor. It begins not with a holy sign or a royal decree, but with the sound of thousands of boot soles flattening the ancient. Track a dull rhythmic thud that swallowed all other noise. This sound is the true pulse of the world. Now a slow, relentless heartbeat driving an army forward into the hazy. Distance, eh? Single broken wheel lies tilted by the roadside, pokes pointing. Skyward like the skeleton of a fallen star forgotten quickly, already half buried beneath the fine golden dust of the Hungarian plain. No one stops to look at it. No one spares a breath for the poor soul who lost their cart or their life here. The march is everything, the halting is death. The movement is only life sustained by aching muscles and the singular blind focus on the horizon. A friend to Historialube, I am Nazrua, and tonight we walk where the sleepwalkers of history first set their gaze eastward toward the city of gold and dust. Close your eyes now and feel the slow, heavy rhythm of the First Crusade, not the fierce fires of faith, but the relentless grinding of the road itself, where exhaustion was the only constant. Companion, the year is 1096. The high summer sun beats down on helmets. Turned dull by travel, the great host has been walking for months already, their feet learning the language of stone and gravel, a dialect of pain understood equally by noblemen and peasant alike. The early enthusiasm of the great gathering in France and Germany has long since evaporated, replaced by a kind of numb endurance. A waking sleep where the miles dissolve one into the next in a seamless flow of movement and light imagine. The air thick and warmed, smelling faintly of stale sweat and consecrated oil of sour wine and unwashed linen, a human stench carried only slightly away by the weak breeze that whispers across the vast open fields. This breeze offers no cooling, only the movement of more dust into weary eyes. Dust settles everywhere, a fine powdery veil, coating the chainmail, turning the rich crimson of standards into faded pink, burying the silver cross on the shield faces until they look like lumps of tarnished. Lead the knights ride stiffly encased in iron prisons, the sun turning their helms into small burning ovens beneath which faces stream with sweat and grime. The horses too are ghosts of their former selves, their flanks gaunt, their heads hanging. Low their hooves striking the earth with a weary echo, a sound different from the soft impact of the common soldier's hobnail boots. Listen. Closely now listen to the sound of march itself. It is not a unified roar, but 100,000 distinct small sounds merging into one overwhelming drone, the creak of leather saddles, the incessant, high-pitched grating of metal on metal where the plates of armor rub together. The low murmur of prayers whispered in various dialects, the occasional sharp cry of a child or the cursing of a mule driver struggling with a stubborn pack animal. These sounds of the lullaby of the road, the white noise of a collective burden carried. Eastward, look at the sky above it is a pale blue, so vast it seems to press the landscape flat. The sun rises, an eye of bruised amber over the fields of Hungary, a massive, relentless clock marking the hours of suffering. The horizon is never broken by anything satisfying, only by the perpetual promise of more emptiness, more. Walking more dust, the column moves as a single segmented creature, a slow, powerful beast cloaked in iron and linen and faith. The width of the path is filled completely, sometimes spilling into the bordering fields, trampling the low scrub and the occasional small farmers' crops, creating a swath of destruction that marks their passing like a giant scar. The weight of the armor is unforgiving. The heavy hauberk woven of countless small iron rings hangs from the shoulders, dragging the body down into the gravitational pull of the earth. Each step is a conscious effort, a battle against the desire to simply fall where you stand and surrender to the warmth of the dust. The men carry not just their weapons, but the expectation of God. Future of their families, the shame of leaving behind everything known, a crushing spiritual weight, added to the 60 pounds of steel. Strapped to their bodies, they are following the ancient tracks etched deep into the earth by centuries of empire. By Roman legions, by barbarian tribes, by merchant caravans. These roads are not paved with ease, but with history hard-packed and unforgiving, telling a silent story of ceaseless movement toward some distant goal at midday when the heat becomes unbearable. The column might stop for an hour, a brief, hushed pause. The only sounds then are the sucking noise of men drinking warm, stagnant water from leather flasks, the low groans of exhausted men easing their muscles, and the endless buzzing of flies, a thick cloud of them attracted by the heat and the refuse left behind. The pause is never restful. The relief of standing still only illuminates the intense pain that has been temporarily suppressed by the forward. Momentum, legs tremble, muscles spasm, backs ache. The sun still burns. They are simply waiting for the inevitable command to move the signal that pulls them back into the trance of motion. And they are sustained by meager rations, sometimes dried bread, sometimes salted pork that tastes only of brine and age, often nothing at all. Hunger is a constant shadow, a dull ache in the stomach that gnaws at the edges of the resolve, making the world seem dimmer. The journey longer. Nightfall brings a different kind of burden. The day's heat slowly bleeds away, leaving the air cool, sometimes even chilled, but the exhaustion deepens. The encampments are sprawling, chaotic affairs, thousands of fires glowing like embers scattered across the dark velvet landscape. The smoke rises straight up in the still air, carrying the smell of burning wood and cooking meat, if they are lucky, or merely the smell of damp earth and disappointment. Sleep is precious and usually broken. The men sleep in shifts, the common soldiers huddled close together. For warmth, the knights resting beneath small, hastily erected pavilions. Their dreams are not of glory or Jerusalem, yet their dreams are mundane. They are haunted by the memory of a cool stream in Burgundy, a full loaf of bread, a soft bed free from the intrusion of rock and root. Above them, the sky is a bowl of polished black obsidian, dusted with silver pinpricks of light. The silence of the night is profound, but never complete, always broken by the distant whinny of a picket horse, the muffled cough of a sentinel, the low cry of a night bird, and always the restless shifting of thousands of sleeping bodies are moving away from the familiar languages, away from the familiar faces of Europe, now deep into the territories where Greek is spoken and where the customs are strange and sometimes hostile. They feel the distance increasing, not just in miles, but in familiarity. The world is subtly changing around them, becoming less predictable, more ancient, and less welcoming. They enter the lands controlled by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios, a territory that views this massive armed influx not as a liberation, but as a threatening invasion. The Byzantine guides assigned to them are taciturn, their faces etched with suspicion. They lead the Crusaders along routes that avoid the main cities, shunting them around the edges of civilization to prevent chaos, but ensuring that supplies become scarce. The difficulty now is no longer the sheer act of walking, it is the lack of trust. The feeling of being watched, of being resented by the very Christians they expected to welcome them. The tension is a low current running beneath the surface of the march, ready to spark into violence at the slightest provocation. They pass fields of standing grain which they are forbidden to touch, and see villages walled high, their inhabitants peering down with nervous faces, refusing to open their gates. The Crusaders begin to feel like starving ghosts marching through a world that rejects their presence. One Knight Eustace of Blois, a heavy man known for his impatience, rides near the front. His armor has scratched, his plume long since lost. He looks perpetually fatigued, his eyes red-rimmed from dust and sleeplessness. He focuses on the rhythm of his horse's hooves, counting them endlessly, a hypnotic exercise to shut out the larger scale of the agony. Thinks sometimes of the day he left his wife and children, the bright sun on the morning of departure, the cheers of the local populace, a moment of blinding glory. He clings to that memory because the reality of the road is too tedious, too ugly to sustain the fervor. Landscape begins to change. The flat plains give way to rolling hills, then to truly unforgiving mountains. A landscape of stone and shadow, a different beast entirely. The path narrows, forcing the great host to string out even further, a thin ribbon of humanity stretching for miles, making communication and organization almost impossible. The road here is rougher, the stone sharper, the incline steeper. Every step is a deliberate lift and placement of the tired foot. The horses struggle, slipping on the loose rock. The air is thin and cold at night, a shocking contrast to the burning heat of the plains. They move past ancient crumbling forts built millennia ago, by forgotten men, structures of gray stone, half swallowed by the scrubland, but still possessing a somber majesty. The scale of history here is humbling. These lands have seen empires rise and fall. I may regard this passing army of Westerners with silent indifference. The land itself seems to say, you too will pass away. The dust now is mixed with fine rock particles, grinding painfully into joints and equipment. The sound of the march changes too now, a more desperate shuffle punctuated by the scraping sound of equipment hitting rock face. The clatter of loose stones kick down the slope. Water sources become difficult to find. Sometimes they march for days on the meager remnants in their flasks, praying for a well or a hidden spring. When they find one, it becomes a moment of frantic chaos. Thousands rushing forward, their thirst overwhelming their discipline, men shoving for the cooling liquid, a desperate temporary madness that speaks volumes about their physical state. The sun sets here in the mountains behind jagged peaks. A display of fire and bruised orange and deep purple light casting long unsettling shadows. Down the valleys, the air cools rapidly, sinking into the bones of the men who have sweated through the day. They wrap themselves in cloaks smelling of wood smoke and old wool, pulling the fabric tight against the evening. Chill Eustace of Blois stops one evening at the crest of a ridge, looking out over the valley below. Thousands of fires flicker like disturbed fireflies, stretching away into the darkness, an endless sea of commitment. He pulls a small carved wooden cross from beneath his tunic. Holding the smooth cold wood tightly, his mind is empty of grand strategies, empty of theological debate. There's only the exhaustion and the silent demanding necessity of the road ahead. He knows they have crossed the threshold. There's no easy turning back, no simple walk home. They are now irrevocably committed to this path, bound by their oaths, and by the simple fact that the distance they have covered is greater than the strength they have left to retreat. They are nearing Constantinople, the great city of the Eastern Empire, the meeting point of continents, the halfway mark, a place that promises resupply and perhaps temporary rest, but also confrontation and deep mistrust. The name whispers through the weary ranks, a symbol of hope and fear, the last great bastion of civilization before the true wilderness of the Turkish lands tomorrow. They will descend into a wider valley, a long, arduous descent that will test the animals and the men alike. Tomorrow they will face the Byzantine officials who will try to count them, control them, corral them like troublesome cattle. Tomorrow is simply the promise of more effort, more pain, more distance yet to be covered. Eustace looks eastward toward the black bulk of the distant mountains, a darker line against the fading sky. He does not see the holy city. He sees only the next ridge, the next stretch of barren ground, the next mile that must be consumed by his protesting feet. The wind rises slightly, carrying the distant lonely sound of a bugle call muffled by the distance, the command to prepare, to rest, to hold, to wait for the sunrise. It is a long night here in the mountains, a night of hard rock and deep dreams in the slow, grinding realization that the journey is the true penance, the true measure of their dedication, a trial of months and years, not moments. They sleep for now, the immense body of the marching host, settling down like a wounded animal, waiting for the cruel light of dawn to force it onward. The world shifts. Not suddenly, but in the hushed measurement of footfalls, a constant slow grind of leather against grit, a sound that begins before dawn and only ceases when the velvet darkness fully blankets the exhausted host. It is the commitment that matters. The heavy, beautiful truth of walking across the whole known world for a city seen only in stained glass and sacred dreams. Welcome to Historylube. I am Nazrula, and tonight we begin a long, slow journey with the First Crusade story. Not of battle yet, but of the profound, wearying weight of time. This is the March of 1096 AD, a movement of hundreds of thousands of souls, leaving the fertile river valleys of home, trading the soft green comfort of France and Germany for the harsh, endless stone of the East. It began with a fervent, chaotic rush, a great swell of piety and population, pushing eastwards across Europe where the roads were thin and supplies non-existent for such numbers. The early months were defined by the sheer impossible logistics of movement. Imagine the scale. The column stretches back beyond sight, a living river of humanity, meandering through the wide river plains of the continent. Thousands of men in ill-fitting mail, thousands more simply clad in rough wool tunics, thousands of women and children bundled into carts or clutching the hands of fathers who might never return. Air is never clean, always seasoned, with the heavy, unmistakable flavor of iron, sweat, and dust. The dust is the first constant. Companion of the Crusader march, it is fine pale earth, pulverized by countless hooves and sandals. Rising in slow billowing clouds that catch the morning sun and turn the landscape into a shimmering amber haze, this dust settles on everything it coats the rough beards of the knights, turning them gray and old before their time. It filters into the tightly woven linen of the clothes. It scratches the throat and it settles deep into the eyes, blurring the vision until the distant horizon seems merely a suggestion, not a promise. The mornings are cold despite the approaching summer heat. The remnants of the campfire smoke cling low to the ground, mingling with the breath of the animals. The heavy oxen pulling the few carts loaded with relics and limited provisions. Before the first light truly breaks, the air is shattered by the insistent call of trumpets. Rough handmade horns sounding the call to fold camp, to rise from the damp earth where they slept wrapped in cloaks or under the shared shelter of a wagon. The knights struggle into their chainmail, a heavy ritual of linking metal, clanking softly in the pre-dawn. Quiet, each ring cold against the skin, a reminder of the sacrifice soon to be demanded. The peasants move faster they have less to carry, and their duties are immediate tending to the fires, gathering the last handfuls of grain, seeing that the children are ready for the seemingly infinite journey ahead. Then the movement begins slowly, haltingly, at first like a vast stone wheel starting to turn after decades of rest. The sound is overwhelming. It is the creak of wooden axles, the lowing of cattle, the muttered prayers in Latin and vernacular, the heavy rhythmic thump of walking sticks against the hard-packed earth. Horses, the few they have, are already showing the strain in their ribs. Visible beneath the sweat and darkened hides, they are not accustomed to such sustained, arduous movement, pulling the weight of armed men day after day across unfamiliar terrain. By mid-morning, the sun is high and relentless, beating down on the slow procession. The heat becomes a tangible weight, pressing exhaustion onto the shoulders of the marchers. The shields carried by the men reflect the harsh light back upwards, multiplying the misery of the heat, making the long hours seem agonizingly slower. The rhythm of the day settles into a trance, purely physical meditation. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, the mantra of the road. You watch the back of the man ahead of you, his shoulders bow, his pace steady, his vulnerability strangely comforting in its familiarity. Memorize the stitching on his tunic, the way his scabbard rubs against his thigh, the slight limp he has developed since crossing the great river the week before. Your own body fades into the background, an instrument of pure endurance. Mind becomes hushed, focused only on the immediate need for water, the slight shift of the pack, the small relief offered by a passing cloud. They pass through endless forests where the sunlight breaks through the canopy in fragmented shards of gold and green. The ground here is softer, covered in pine needles and damp earth. A brief respite from the stone and grit, but the paths are winding and the visibility is poor sparking. Fear of ambush or separation, they pass ancient settlements, villages of thatched roofs and terrified faces. The local populace is both awed and deeply apprehensive of this vast moving wave of strangers. Sometimes the villagers offer bread, sometimes water. Sometimes nothing, only the silence of fear as they watch the host march past their fields. Their precious summer crops trampled under the endless tide of feet. The discipline of the column is tenuous at best. There is no single army but a collection of forces led by proud, often competing lords, Bohemond of Tarento, Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, each with their own contingent, their own supplies. Their own methods. The common folk, the great mass of the poorer Crusaders, often outpace the slow, heavy tread of the armored knights, seeking food and faster progress, only to find themselves starving or attacked miles ahead of the main force. The hours of walking are measured not by the clock, a luxury few possess, but by the shadow of the sun, by the shifting hues of the sky when the sun reaches its zenith, casting no shadow. The heat is unbearable, and the column sometimes halts for a brief hour, a moment of heavy breathing and shared silence. The only sound, the buzz of flies and the restless snorting of the horses. Is during these halts that the true toll of the journey becomes visible. Our inspected blisters, the size of small stones, raw and weeping, are bandaged with strips of scavenged cloth, or simply ignored water skins. Our ration, the liquid inside lukewarm and tasting heavily of the leather container. A precious commodity nonetheless. The knights remove their helmets, their faces pale and sweating, their hair plastered to their foreheads, their eyes already sunken. From weeks of fatigue, they speak little Jerusalem, yet the distance is too vast to abstract. They speak of the nearest river, the next village, the rumor of fresh spring water 3 days. Hence hope is measured in tiny practical increments, not in grand visions of the holy city. As the afternoon progresses, the shadows lengthen, and the light turns a softer yellower shade. The walking becomes slightly easier, the heat less punishing, but the fatigue is now absolute. It is the kind of deep aching tiredness that permeates the bone, turning every muscle into lead, every step an act of profound will. Heavy cloaks worn in the morning are now draped over arms or rolled up and fastened to packs. The smell of stale wool and sweat a constant personal halo. They walk until the light fails, until the long shadows of the trees stretch across the path like dark skeletal arms, until the air turns abruptly cool, signaling the rapid descent of night. The halting of the column is always chaotic and welcome. Sudden cessation of motion makes the ears ring. A strange quiet descends, broken quickly by the sounds of camp, making a place must be found a defensible spot near water, if possible, and the immediate task is survival fires. Our kindled wood is scarce and often green, but the necessity is great for cooking and for warmth. The smell of wood smoke rises, mixing with the damp earth and the roasting of what a rigor. Rations were secured that day, perhaps dried fish, hard bread, stale cheese, or if they were lucky, a stray chicken procured from a hesitant local farmer. The night is when the stories are told, the legends of the saints and the whispered rumors of the trials ahead around the small, fiercely guarded fires. Men share news from the front of the column or the rear tales of lost comrades, of miraculous finds of water, the immense political maneuvering happening far away in Constantinople, a city they had not yet reached, but whose shadow already loomed large. The camp settles into a state of hushed vigilance. Sentries are posted, cloaked figures pacing the perimeter, their shapes blurring against the darkness, their movements stiff from exhaustion. Sleep is deep and immediate, a necessity, not a luxury. You lie down in the cold earth to stone. Beneath your back, a rough bed, the sounds of the camp dissolving into a low humming drone that guides you down into the dark abyss of rest. The sleep is heavy, dreamless, often disturbed by the cold or the need to shift a limb that has gone numb, but it is restorative enough to face the impossible task of the next dawn days. Bleed into weeks and weeks into the passage of seasons. The spring freshness of start of the journey is long gone, replaced by the dry heat of high summer, the sun burning the grass yellow, the rivers running low and slow. They pass out of familiar Frankish territories and into the foreign lands, towards the Byzantine border, towards the realm of the Hungarians and the Slavs, where the language is sharp and guttural and the reception is often hostile. The landscape changes to soft. Rolling hills give way to rougher ground broken by jutting formations of ancient stone. The march becomes more arduous, climbing rocky inclines, slipping on loose shale, the carts requiring constant heaving and pushing the animals, faltering frequently. Supplies dwindle, the initial and that fueled the first weeks is replaced by grinding. Resentment and fatigue. The commoners often suffer the worst. Starving, desperate, they resort to foraging far and wide, sometimes resulting in skirmishes with the locals who fiercely guard their harvests. The leaders struggle to maintain order. They issue harsh edicts against looting, but hunger is a fierce master, and the sheer volume of the host makes control impossible. Great chroniclers who walk among them, men like Fulcher of Chartres, take note of the difficulties of the spirit, the constant trials of patience and faith. They write of the incredible endurance of the common man, the depth of belief required to undertake this endless punishing walk. Every sunrise brings a renewed commitment to the pilgrimage. The sun rises, a bloody orb over the eastern horizon, casting the long shadows of the marching column ahead of them, pointing always towards the Holy Land, always towards the east. The movement of the feet becomes subconscious, a bodily function, like breathing or blinking you feel. The slight unevenness of the ground through the thin leather sole, the warmth of the sun spreading across your neck, the stiffness in the knees. The familiar ache of the spine, the iron of the sword, hilt against the hip, becomes an extension of the self-heavy constant present. The prayers muttered throughout the day are less formal supplications, more rhythmic chants to keep the pace steady. Sanctus, 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 repeated softly, under the breath marking the passage of the miles. When they reach a river, a broad, slow current of cool water, the relief is immense. The entire host slows down the column, widens the men and animals, rushing to drink to cool their scorched skin, to wash the perpetual dust from their faces. The water feels like a balm. Against the weary flesh, a momentary return to life. A brief pause in the relentless advance, they spend hours crossing these water barriers. The engineering primitive and slow, the men using logs and hastily constructed rafts or wading shoulder deep in the cold current, holding their weapons above the surface. Stone banks on the far side are often slippery, muddy, the climb exhausting, costing precious energy, and often leading to arguments and jostling among the tired soldiers. The journey is a constant study in contrasts, the occasional moment of profound beauty, a sunset painting the sky in violent shades of purple and amber, the velvet stillness of a field of rye, whispering in the evening breeze contrasted with the ugliness of the camp. The sickness, the dysentery that sweeps through the ranks, the dying animals, the relentless gnawing anxiety of the miles yet to go. The days turn into late summer, the air growing heavy and humid, sometimes broken by sudden violent thunderstorms that turn the dusty roads into thick, heavy mire, trapping the carts and plunging the marching men into profound discomfort. The mud clings to the boots, dragging at the feet, weighing down the armor, soaking the wool cloaks, turning the camp into a miserable swamp. But even the rain cannot stop the march. They continue slowly splashing through the mire, the smell of wet wool and damp earth replacing the dust. The sheer will of the leadership keeps them moving. They understand instinctively that stopping for more than a day is dangerous, that momentum once lost is impossible to regain. They pass into the territories near the Byzantine Empire, the Emperor Alexius Komnenos, watching this massive, unstoppable force approaching his borders with deep suspicion and nervousness. The discipline of the Western Knights is poor. Their demands for food are incessant. Their presence destabilizing. They are now months into the journey. The bodies are hard and scarred, but the spirits are worn thin. Their early summer clothes are threadbare. The leather cracked, the edges of the armor rusted by sweat and rain. They have covered immense distance, vast stretches of Europe that few men in their time would ever see yet. The great city of Constantinople, the gateway to Asia Minor, the required passage point, is still ahead of them, a looming monumental presence on the horizon of their exhaustion. The landscape begins to change. The rough stone gives way to more engineered roads, remnants of ancient Roman highways, a subtle sign that they are approaching the heart of sophisticated civilization. These roads are welcome. Smoother underfoot, allowing for a slightly faster pace, but they also signal the complexity of the political landscape. They are about to enter, they are leaving. The familiarity of independent kingdoms, entering the structured ancient world of the Eastern Empire. The thought of Constantinople fills them with awe and apprehension. It is a city of legend, a place of immense wealth and strange customs, a world away from the damp stone castles and simple life of the West. They look towards the east, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the imperial might of Byzantium. The nights are drawing in earlier now, the chill of the early autumn beginning to settle on the land, promise of the hard winter that they must desperately outrun. Marching continues, always forward, the heavy dull beat of the thousands of feet against the stone earth, a relentless sound that carries the weight of history, and the slow hypnotic certainty of faith driving this enormous, weary mass towards the distant shores of destiny. Air smells of wood smoke and the sharp metallic scent of fatigue. The silent prayer remains the same, help us to rise tomorrow, and walk toward Jerusalem. Air grows heavy, now weighted thick with the passing of 1,000 years. Carries the faint scent of crushed lavender and stone dust and deep slumber. Let the sound of your breathing settle slow, and even imagine standing upon a floor of marble cold beneath your bare feet. A vast space stretches away in every direction. Ceilings are vaulted shadows, so high they vanish into the atmospheric gloom. Only a single slender beam of moonlight cuts the darkness, illuminating. Nothing but the slow, relentless dance of invisible motes these. Are the spirits of forgotten words, the last residue of history's untold, feel the quiet pressing against your ears? A silence so profound it seems to hum with potential energy. You are standing at the threshold of history's deepest well. We are here at the edge of the known map where knowledge becomes whisper. Welcome, weary traveler, to History Lube AM Nazrula. And tonight we enter the hushed halls where the great stories sleep, allow the noises of the waking world to dissolve like mist on sun-warmed glass. Let the velvet darkness gather soft and safe around you. Begin our journey in the city that was once the undisputed mind of the world. Alexandria, and not the bustling port of Caesar. Or the Hellenic jewel of old Alexandria, long after its prime, when the salt air tastes strongly of ruin and forgotten ink. The great library is not banished, it is merely deeply sleeping. Its foundations still rest upon the earth, its labyrinthine structure cloaked in shadow and silence, protected by the sheer weight of what it once held. Desert has tried to claim it. The sea has attempted to wash it clean, but the ancient stone resists the erosion of time and tide. Here lives the last of the true keepers of the scrolls. His name is Elite, the archivist. He is a man born for the quiet task defined by the duty of inventory and guardianship. He moves through the shelves and galleries like a ghost bound by ritual. His sandals barely scrape the polished limestone each night. He carries a small lantern, the flame contained and steady, throwing a modest circle of amber light on the tightly rolled papyrus spines. Elias's task is not to read the immense volume of knowledge that surrounds him. His job is simply to guard the silence that protects it, though. Ensure that the dust settles soft and undisturbed. He knows every niche, every volume, every hidden alcove by the feel of the air and the slight shift in temperature. Tonight, however, the routine is fractured day. Coldness has begun to emanate not from the ancient walls, but from the heart of the collection itself. Elias has been drawn away from the main cataloging room into the deepest. Subulvelthus is the Forbidden's Wing, the area marked not inventus, lost, or perhaps never meant to be found. Air here is noticeably drier, the scrolls brittle, dangerous. The scent of cedar oil and decay is potent, silence absolute. Holds his breath as he passes rows upon rows of scrolls that predate the city itself. They speak of pharaohs before the pyramids, of gods who walked the delta lands before history learned to write their names. His lantern beam settles upon a wall of unfinished shelving. It stops abruptly before reaching the cavernous stone. There is a niche there, a rectangular depression not listed in the master index, not carved by any known mason of the Ptolemaic line. Is simply there an absence in the stone. Elias reaches forward, his fingers tracing the cold, sharp edges. Feels newer than the surrounding rock and yet impossibly old. Pushes against a faint seam and the niche opens with a hushed, grinding sound of stone against stone protesting. Its disturbance after centuries. Inside rests a single item. It is not a scroll of papyrus. It is not vellum or leather or clay tableted. It is a sheet of thin hammered copper rolled tightly and tied with a thread of faded crimson silk. Elias lifts it slowly. The metal cool and startlingly heavy in his palm. The copper has not patinated to green. It retains a dark metallic sheen like highly polished obsidian. When he unrolls it gently, the sound is not a rustle but a dry, sharp metallic snap. The light of his small lamp catches the surface, revealing that the sheet is not written upon with ink. It is etched. The symbols are deep cut into the metal, strange glyphs that twist and intertwine like sleeping serpents. Elias knows every known script from Sumerian to Phoenician, from Demotic to the forgotten Coptic of the desert monasteries, but this script is alien. It does not flow. It does not tell a story. Seems to pulse with a residual coldness, a faint shiver that runs up the copper and into his hand. Studies the etching, feeling a profound sense of wrongness. This item should not exist within the walls of Alexandria. Belongs to the deep places, to the shadows beneath the root of the world. He holds the lantern closer, squinting at the fine precise lines. One symbol repeats itself tirelessly, the image of an eye closed, eternally shielded by a jagged crown. As his eye traces the symbols, the archivist realizes. This is not history he holds. It is not a record of things past. It is a warning. The script speaks of deep sleep beneath the sands of cycles that turn slow beyond human comprehension. It speaks of awaiting a sentinel standing watch over something immeasurably vast and tremendously. Patient Elias feels the floor beneath his sandals shift. Slightly not an earthquake tremor, but a deep subsonic vibration felt more in the bone than the ear. Turns his head slowly, listening, not for sound, but for the cessation of silence. The air in the Forbidden's wing thickens, suddenly becoming almost viscous. He looks back at the copper scroll, the cold metal, now feeling feverish in his grasp. The closed eye symbol seems to bulge slightly, as if straining to open. And then Elias hears at a sound that is not a sound at all, but the impression of movement. In the deepest darkness, far, far beneath the library floor, like the slow rhythmic scrape of something heavy being drawn across rough bedrock. Something is stirring in the depths. Something ancient and patient has just noticed the small light of the archivist's lamp. He rolls the copper shut quickly, the crimson silk sliding silently into place. He knows he cannot leave this strange metal artifact here. It is the key to whatever lies waiting below. Elias slides the small scroll inside the lining of his robe, feeling the icy weight of the secret pressed against his heart. He extinguishes the lamp, the small flame sputtering, dying instantly. The darkness rushes in thick and absolute, smelling, now faintly of ozone and something mineral. He is cloaked in the silence, but the scraping sound continues, insistent and steady, far below the foundations of stone. Elias begins to move back toward the known world, step by painstaking step. He must reach the surface before the sound reaches him. He must protect the library from the thing that the copper scroll warns against. And he realizes with a chilling certainty that the thing has only just begun to wake. The stone is vibrating. The silence is shattered. He is alone in the ancient dark, holding a truth that should have remained buried for 10,000 years. He moves blindly toward the main stairs, listening to the sound of something rising slow and heavy from the depths of the earth. The journey has just begun. The chill breath of the pre-dawn mist still held the edges of the camp, a thin gray shroud over the tired sleepers. The cold dew clung like tiny glass beads to the velvet moss near the stream bed where the heavy horses drank. A hushed stillness before the great iron noise began. The noise that was the army waking, a slow, painful creaking rising from the earth itself. The vast undertaking of moving thousands of souls, one foot in front of the next, toward distant shimmering goal. The silence broke first with the coughs, the dry throats, rasped raw by days of walking, and the relentless dust. Then came the metallic sound of harness settling, the clatter of hastily assembled armor, the dull thudding rhythm of wooden mallets hammering tent pegs back into the frozen ground. The scent of stale smoke and damp wool mingled heavily with the sharp tang of horse manure, a pungent cocktail that defined the beginning of every single day. Now, one day, bleeding indistinguishably into the last, a long, unending river of physical effort flowing steadily eastward toward the great city they knew, lay ahead the key to the journey's second phase. Sun rose now, an amber eye peering over the eastern ridges, burning away the last cool shadows, transforming the air into a shimmering heat haze. Visible even before noon, the great road, if it could be called a road, was merely a scar etched across the landscape, churned up by the passage of earlier groups and the relentless wheels of supply carts. The dust rose thick and red like powdered stone, coating every exposed surface, every weary face, every piece of dull steel, every sack of dried grain. It tasted of earth and sweat and anticipation, a strange bitter flavor that clung to the back of the throat, hour after hour, mile after endless mile. The columns stretched back into the distance, a long winding serpent of faith and desperation. The mailed knights rode ahead, their heavy cloaked figures shimmering slightly in the heat waves, their armor now dulled, not shining, reflecting only the dust. And the slow passage of time behind them shuffled the great bulk of the walking pilgrims, the poor, the zealots, the weary mothers, clutching small tired children, their simple wooden crosses knocking gently against their chests, a steady rhythmic click accompanying the heavy thump of the marching boots, a monotonous pulse beating out the journey's slow progress, a sound that burrowed deep into the subconscious mind until it became the only music, the only measure of existence, Lord. Godfrey rode near the vanguard, his face set hard against the monotony. The polished steel of his helm was gone, replaced by a simple leather cap to ward off the direct glare of the sun. The weight of his mail shirt felt less like protection, and more like a crushing burden designed solely to exhaust his spirit. The ground beneath his horse's hooves offered no variation, no comforting shift in texture, only the endless dry soil, the small sharp stones, the occasional bleached white bone of an animal that had succumbed to the hardship before them. He watched the land unfold, flat, dull, indifferent to the purpose of their sacred journey. Fields long abandoned lay fallow, waiting for rain that did not come, waiting for hands that had moved on or perished. The lack of landmarks was perhaps the most psychologically draining aspect of the march days. Blurred into weeks into the heavy turning of a full month since they had left the familiar territory of the west, the forests. They passed where generic, the rivers merely obstacles requiring slow, frustrating crossings. The villages that sometimes appeared were sullen, cautious, their inhabitants hiding behind ancient stone walls, unwilling to share their precious water. Their meager stores fearing the sheer, hungry size of this monstrous host moving through their quiet world. Each afternoon brought the worst of the day, the high sun beating down, mercilessly creating mirages that danced on the horizon, promising shimmering lakes of water that evaporated before they could be reached, promising cool shade beneath. Ancient trees that turned out to be nothing more than stunted, thorny brush. The men walked with their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the boot heels immediately. In front of them, focusing their entire universe into a 3-foot span of churned dirt. Anything beyond that narrow view was a luxury. They could no longer afford the focus needed to manage the pain in their ankles, the blisters forming beneath the heavy cloth, the chafing of the leather belts, the constant ache in the lower back where the meager pack rested its unrelenting pressure. The soundscape of the march during these peak hours was defined by exhaustion, the collective heavy breathing of thousands of men struggling for air, the creak of the wagon wheels, protesting their heavy loads, the low, mournful cries of the oxen, and the occasional sharp, cracking sound of a whip urging a flagging animal forward. There was little singing now. The initial fervor had been sweated out, bled out, dissolved into the dust. Instead, there were only the muttered prayers, the low requests for mercy, the quiet promises made to the heavens if only the next hour could pass swiftly and bring the welcome shadow of evening. The chainmail worn by the heavy infantry resonated with their stride, a steady shush-shush, like dry leaves dragged across granite, a metallic whispering that never ceased, a reminder of the warriors' obligation. Even in this state of profound fatigue, the foot soldiers, their faces cloaked in grime, often found small ways to distract themselves, counting their steps, trying to guess the shape of the next shadow, attempting to memorize the patterns formed by the scattered stones, anything to stop the mind from dwelling on the vast impossible distance still stretching out between their current misery and the walls of the holy city. Sometimes a messenger would ride back along the line, his horse moving at a swift trot, kicking up an even greater cloud of choking red powder, shouting reassurances or relaying logistical orders. And for a brief moment, the heads would lift, the tired eyes blinking against the grit, searching for information, any scrap of news that suggested progress was being made, that the sacrifice was paying off, that they were closer to the end than they felt. But the moment passed quickly. The horse disappeared into the dust cloud, and the heads dropped once more back to the contemplation of the next step, the next breath, the next small necessary act of survival. Nights offered only a partial respite. The exhaustion was too profound to be easily shaken off even when the men lay down in the cold, hard earth. The effort of the day imprinted itself deep into the muscles, twitching restless sleep, broken by the sudden sharp noise of a skirmish over a bucket of water, or the deep, guttural growl of a guard dog patrolling the perimeter. Fires dotted the massive encampment, little islands of orange light in the vast field of blackness. They cast long dancing shadows onto the rough faces of the men huddled around them, shadows that made the tired features look ancient. Stone, carved by hardship and faith. Godfrey would often walk the camp perimeter late into the night, watching the faces of his men, trying to gauge the breaking point, the moment When the physical suffering became spiritual failure, the pilgrims were often the most resilient, fueled by an elemental. Simple faith that transcended hunger and thirst. They carried relics, simple carved wooden saints, bits of bone, wrapped in linen, and they prayed with a fierce, quiet intensity that seemed to draw strength directly from the stars. Above the camp smelled. Different at night, the dominant scent of dust and heat gave way to the heavy aroma of stew cooking over small fires, mixed with the musty odor of wet wool and the medicinal sharpness of herbs, used to treat the ever-present wounds and diseases dysentery. Stalked the ranks a silent, merciless enemy, claiming strength and life without the glory of battle leaving. The survivors weakened and constantly fearful of the next infection. The logistical challenge was monumental. Every day it demanded immense resources. Fodder for the horses, food for the men, and the land they traversed was increasingly unwilling to provide it. They were moving through lands that had already been stripped by others, or were simply too poor to sustain such a massive temporary city. Their foraging parties returned often empty-handed, or having fought skirmishes with local militias. Fiercely defending their meager stores of grain and sheep, the leaders faced continuous difficult choices, pressing forward to escape areas depleted of resources, but increasing the distance between their supply points, or arresting and risking the morale breaking down due to the stagnation. The only viable option always seemed to be the forward movement, the relentless push onward, a slow, inexorable creep that measured progress not in days or weeks, but in the shifting angle of the North Star and the way the moon waxed and waned above the darkening landscape. The feeling of being cloaked in perpetual exhaustion was common. The men moved as if submerged in thick, viscous water. Every movement required extreme effort. The simple act of drawing water from a well or tending to a saddle felt like an hour of grueling labor. Their thoughts, too, became slow, cumbersome, like lead weights sinking gradually toward the bottom of a deep well. There was no room for sophisticated strategy or complex thought, only the primal need to survive the next 12 hours and the steadfast hope that Jerusalem was truly worth this profound, sustained misery. Ancient stones of the path, they sometimes followed remnants of Roman roads long since cracked and overgrown, offered a momentary hardness beneath their worn boots, a connection to a history that stretched far beyond their immediate quest, a silent promise that this land had witnessed immense movements before them, great armies, great migrations, passing like shadows, yet the stones themselves offered no comfort, no water, only a brief change in the texture of the ground, reminding them how small and fleeting their current suffering was in the vast span of time. Morning broke, an oppressive golden amber light flooding the eastern sky, signaling the renewal of the cycle. The order to move was given. The slow grinding process of breaking camp began anew. The metallic whisper of chains, the muffled shouts, the steady rhythmic thump of boots hitting the dry earth. Another day of walking stretching out ahead of them, an infinity of red dust and aching silence. They stepped out onto the path. The weary pilgrimage, continuing the great machine of the Crusades, turning slowly, surely toward the unseen horizon, toward the promise of the East. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other was the ultimate measure of their faith. The long, slow, tedious march, a silent prayer, etched across the body of the European continent, and the morning air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and stale sweat. Cold moisture clinging to the cloaks of the sleeping men gave way to a hazy sun, a pale disk rising slowly above the eastern hills. It promised another day of endless friction between the iron boots and the ancient stone roads laid down by Caesar's long dead. The column stirred, a great groaning beast stretching its limbs across the Balkan ridges. No words of welcome were needed, only the persistent drone of necessity, the low call for water, the metallic click of chainmail being adjusted for the day's relentless 12 miles. They were deep inside the emperor's lands now, traversing the crumbling infrastructure of the Byzantine realm. This was not the easy march promised by the preachers. This was a weary calculation of forage and pace. Each Lord led his a river of slow-moving steel and faith. Raymond of St. Gilles, the massive Count of Toulouse, kept his southern contingent moving with practiced military discipline. Godfrey of Bouillon, the quiet Duke of Lower Lorraine, favored silence, letting the steady rhythm of their hooves and feet set the pace. The landscape was etched with suspicion. Every village they passed was hushed doors, barred faces peering from behind ruffian timbers. The local Greeks viewed the Latins not as liberators or fellow Christians, but as a hungry, unstoppable flood consuming everything. In its path, the sun climbed higher, transforming the morning haze into a blinding mantle of heat. Dust, the pervasive, fine-paled dust, was inescapable. It rose from the thousands of feet and paws, pulverized earth, turned into a choking cloud that coated the eyelashes, the throat, the leather straps of the harnesses, settled on the surface of the stagnant water barrels, giving everything a gritty taste of the road itself. Men learned to walk within that dust cloud, accepting its presence as a silent companion to their journey. They learned to follow the man in front of them, watching the hypnotic sway of his pack, the repetitive lift and fall of his worn boots, one foot, then the next, one moment, then the next. The road curved through valleys, where the air hung heavy, and still they passed abandoned Roman fortifications. Great blocks of stone crumbling back into the earth, their purpose forgotten, their ancient silence profound. These ruins stood as silent witnesses to the vanity of empire and the terrible slowness of time itself. The horses labored heavily, their flanks slicked with effort. Few mules and oxen pulling the supply carts often balked or stumbled by a constant low level. Noise of correction and strain ran through the column. The snap of a whip, the muttered curse, the weary encouragement given to a failing beast. Armor weighed heavily, a suffocating metal skin a night in the full heat of the day. Carried perhaps 60 pounds of steel and quilted padding it radiated the heat back into his body, trapping the moisture until every movement felt like wading through thick water. They marched always toward the eastern horizon, chasing a phantom city, a promise whispered on the lips of the Pope. The goal seemed infinitely distant, a shining dream that faded slightly with every aching mile. Sometimes a man would simply stop, unable to take the next step. He would sink slowly onto the dry roadside, dropping his shield, letting the dust envelop him. His companions would pass him by, knowing that if the weakness was physical, he might recover, but if it was the soul's exhaustion, the march had claimed him. Rhythm of the march was deceptive. It seemed uniform, but it contained 100,000 tiny stresses. The buckle that chafed the shoulder, the blister that wept on the heel, the dull, relentless ache in the lower back that no prayer could relieve. These minor pains added up mile by mile, accumulating into a velvet shroud of exhaustion round, slowing the thought process until nothing remained but the single command forward when they halted briefly in the middle of the day. The silence was startling, a sudden vacuum where the noise of movement had been. The only sounds were the heavy sighing of the men, the sloshing of water being shared sparingly, and the sharp metallic ring of a blacksmith hammering a loose shoe near. The front of the line, the meal was meager, dry hardtack dipped in watered wine, sometimes a handful of dried beans. Energy provided lasted barely an hour before the grinding depletion began. The afternoon march was the hardest period of battle. Not against an enemy, but against the body's utter refusal to cooperate. The shadows stretched long and thin. Before them, a false promise of evening that would take hours to realize. The land itself seemed to resent their passage they moved through. Fields stripped bare by preceding armies, or barren simply because the harvest was not meant for them. Every blade of grass, every drink of water, every stick of firewood had to be wrestled from the indifferent earth or from the suspicious locals. The Byzantine officials sent by Emperor Alexios were not helpful. They rode small, tough ponies cloaked in deep purple silk symbols of a power these Westerners barely understood. Their language was liquid and fast, their faces unreadable. They guided the Crusaders along predetermined routes often intentionally difficult to keep them away from the fertile heartlands or major cities. There was a profound gulf between the two Christian worlds. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as decadent, overly refined, secretive. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as ignorant, barbarian hordes dressed in rusting iron, smelling of the damp west, coming to plunder their ancient civilization. One night near a small ruined bridge, the tension broke into violence. A group of foraging German knights seeking chickens strayed too close to a protected estate. The local armed guards quickly surrounded them, shouting in Greek. The knights misunderstood or perhaps simply did not care for property rights, swords were drawn. A brief, brutal flurry of steel and panic. The Crusaders lost 2 men, the Greeks lost 4, and suddenly a carefully maintained peace was shattered. The next morning, Raymond of St. Gilles had to ride forward to meet the Byzantine commander, a man named Nicephorus, whose velvet robes and polished manner grated on the Western Count. The meeting was strained, conducted through a translator who seemed too nervous to speak clearly. Nicephorus demanded restitution, the return of stolen livestock. The payment for the lost men, Raymond offered grim apologies and a promise to execute the next man caught stealing, but insisted that his army needed to eat. Negotiations dragged on under the amber heat of the sun for 2 full hours, until a shaky compromise was reached, a small indemnity paid in silver coin, grudgingly extracted from the already depleted war chest. The incident underscored the fragility of their position. They were guests, yet they were powerful enough to be dangerous. They were pilgrims, yet they were an invading force consuming the landscape as. The weeks bled into each other. The initial excitement that had fueled the journey across Europe evaporated, replaced by a bonnet-deep weariness. A resignation to the endless road. The faces of the men grew leaner, their eyes sunk deeper into their sockets, beards grew tangled and wild, cloaking the sharp lines of hunger. Shared faith remained the only true sustenance at the close of day, when the standards were set and the fires were lit. The sound of evening prayer rose from the hundreds of separate camps. It was a slow melodic chant, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in the rough dialects of France or Flanders, but always directed toward the same unseen goal. The sound was comforting. A great collective hum of shared purpose washing over the tired minds. Watchfires crackled, casting erratic shadows that danced on the rough canvas of the tents. The smell of wood smoke was thick and heavy, mingling with the smell of horse manure. And roasting meat, if they were lucky, sleep came hard and fast, a deep, heavy torpor punctuated by the sounds of the night. The nervous whinny of a picket horse, the rustling of unseen creatures in the nearby scrubland, the low rhythmic snoring of a man sleeping the sleep of true exhaustion. The stars above the Balkans were cold and brilliant. They looked down on the sprawling temporary city of the Crusaders. Thousands of tiny lights scattered across the darkened landscape. The men lying beneath them felt infinitely small, caught between the vastness of the heavens and the crushing reality of the earth. Beneath their backs, they dreamed perhaps of home, of cool green fields, of the faces they had left behind, but often their dreams were just confused repetitions of the day's work, endless, walking the dust, rising, the sun beating down, the metallic taste of sweat. Sometimes a man would wake suddenly confused as to which direction they were traveling, which lord he followed, which day was. The identity of the journey became everything. The next landmark was always the focus, the next river, crossing the next defensible hilltop. The days began to blur into a single continuous act of motion, a pilgrimage defined by the weight on the shoulders and the slow movement of the earth beneath the feet. They crossed the Morava River, a tedious process requiring hours of patience and careful handling of the carts. The water was cold and swift, threatening to overturn the already rickety transportmen had to strip down, wading chest deep, to haul the supply wagons across the slick stones. The noise of the crossing was tremendous, shouting, straining, wood grinding against wet stone. The splashing and cursing once across the river seemed like a major victory, a physical obstacle overcome, a mark on the endless tally of distance. But the mud left behind clung to the boots and wheels, increasing the weight of the march. For the subsequent hours they moved through regions of Serbia, harsh country, dry and unforgiving. The stone was hard underfoot, refusing to yield even a thin layer of topsoil. Vegetation was scrubby and tough, clinging fiercely to life. It reminded the men of the severity of the commitment. This was not a walkthrough. The familiar gentle fields of Normandy or Provence, this was a march into the harsh eastern geography, a land indifferent to their holy cause. Heat intensified as they moved south and east. The long woolen tunics and padded gambesons that had been necessary for the cool European nights now became instruments of torment. Water became the most precious commodity, more valuable than silver or even steel. Every man carried a skin flask, but it often emptied within the first few hours of the morning. Marched to cry for water, aqua, aqua, became a constant litany, rising from the ranks bowmen of Taranto, the formidable Norman prince who led the southern Italian contingent was a master of logistics and intimidation. His men were seasoned fighters, hardened by years of skirmishes in southern Italy against the Arabs and the Byzantines themselves. Bohemond maintained discipline with a sharp iron hand, executing looters swiftly and publicly. His camp was orderly, quiet, efficient. His ambition was a palpable thing, a silent velvet pressure pushing his men forward faster than the others. He saw the weakness of the Byzantine Empire. He saw the opportunity for power and land, not just redemption. His gaze was always fixed ahead beyond Jerusalem to the wealthy cities of Asia Minor. His presence was a sharp counterpoint to the quiet piety of Gagad. Determination of Raymond. The differences between the contingents were clear, even in the way they marched. The French of northern France and Flanders, led by Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois, were perhaps the most colorful, sing rough ballads and stopping often to gossip or gamble. Lotharingians under Godfrey were somber, deeply religious, prone to long periods of silent contemplation. Even while walking, the Normans of Bohemond were professional, ruthless, focused only on speed and efficiency. But regardless of their style, all were bound by the shared road. The dust, the exhaustion, their separate identities were slowly being ground down into the single collective identity of the Crusader. They passed through the shadow of the great city of Nish, a place already sacked and left desolate by the earlier chaotic march of Peter the Hermit's people. The sight was sobering, skeletal. Remains lay scattered near the walls, grim reminders of the price of poor planning and premature zeal. The air held the faint metallic scent of Longago violence. They did not linger here. The stench of failure was too strong. They pushed onward toward the city of Sofia, the next major stop on the Byzantine route. The approach to Sofia was marked by an increase in the number of Roman military patrols. The Emperor Alexios was growing increasingly anxious about the immense size of this armed pilgrimage. Sent envoys not just to guide them, but to spy on them, to report every deviation, every skirmish, every perceived slight. Sofia itself was a place of relative guarded markets, stocked with dried fruit and grains, but the Crusaders were not permitted to camp inside the walls. They were directed to the plains outside, where the dust was thick and the wind carried the chill of the nearby mountains. The sight of the city, with its shining domes and organized wealth, only highlighted their own rough appearance, their poverty, and their immediate needs. They spent several days outside Sofia, resupplying, resting the exhausted animals, repairing broken carts, and sharpening dull blades. The pause was necessary, but also frustrating. The men wanted to move forward, the goal still calling them during the rest. Stephen, of relatively wealthy and well-educated French nobleman, wrote a long letter back home to his wife, Adela. He described the journey not with heroic zeal, but with practical exasperation. He wrote of the endless march, the terrible heat, the cost of supplies, the difficulty of dealing with the secretive Greeks. He confessed his weariness, his longing for the comforts of home. His words etched a picture of tedious military drudgery, not glorious spiritual warfare. His letter was carried by a returning merchant traveling back toward the west, a tiny, fragile piece of paper holding the weight of 1,000 miles of struggle. The march resumed, leaving Sofia behind, its clean, organized walls retreating into the distance. Road ahead was the main thoroughfare leading toward Constantinople, the great queen of cities. The anticipation began to build, a slow, creeping excitement replacing the initial exhaustion. They were approaching the heart of the Christian East, the legendary city that stood at the crossroads of the world. The geography became more dramatic. They entered deep passes winding through the Balkan Mountains. The road narrowed, forcing the massive army into a thin, winding snake that stretched for miles. The risk of ambush was high, but the only enemies they encountered were the sharp, jagged stones that cut through worn boot leather and the sudden drops in temperature when the sun dipped behind the peaks. The nights in the mountain passes were cold, biting cold that settled deep into the bones. Small fires offered little comfort. The men huddled together, seeking shared warmth, their breath clouding in the pale moonlight sleep was fitful, disturbed by the cold and the constant worry of guarding the livestock against wolves or thieves. They moved through the mountains, slowly ascending, then descending, always climbing back up. the sight of snow clinging to the highest peaks, even in the early autumn months, was a stark reminder of the long winter that lay ahead if they did not reach Asia Minor soon. The mountain air, however, was clean, a welcome change from the perpetual dust of the plains. Cleared the lungs, and for a brief time lifted the spirits. They followed the course of a deep ravine, the sound of rushing water a constant, powerful background noise. The stone walls of the ravine were sheer, ancient, dark surfaces, etched by millennia of rain and wind. This deep landscape seemed to swallow their sounds, their worries, their presence. They were temporary visitors passing through a world of eternal stone. The journey took them close to Philippopolis, an important staging ground for the Byzantine military. The Crusader lords were forced to negotiate directly with high-ranking generals of Alexius Komnenos. The emperor demanded oaths of fealty. He required that every Western lord swear to return all former Byzantine lands taken from the Turks to the empire. Demand was deeply controversial. Bohemond resisted fiercely, seeing it as a restriction on his future power. Raymond agreed, only reluctantly, binding himself with an oath. That felt more like a political trap than a spiritual covenant. Godfrey of Bouillon initially refused until his brother Baldwin was briefly held by Byzantine forces forcing his hand. The negotiations were slow, deliberate, frustrating exercises in diplomatic maneuvering. Each day spent arguing meant another day away from the Holy Sepulchre. The Byzantine strategy was clear: to contain, to control, to extract maximum promise while minimizing the time the dangerous Westerners spent too close to the capital. Immense friction between the armies and the imperial court was a constant drag on the march, slowing the momentum, draining the energy. Men waited outside the walls of Philippopolis, restless, bored, easily tempted into trouble. There was little to do but clean armor, mend clothing, and discuss the rumors that filtered down from the leaders. Tense rumors of betrayal, of secret pacts of vast wealth offered by the emperor. Tension was thick, a quiet, simmering rage just beneath the surface of the collective patience. When the march finally resumed, the mood was grim. Disciplined but resentful, they had sworn oaths they did not trust to an emperor they did not understand. They were now truly locked into the Eastern political machine, forced to play a role in the intricate, complex world. Constantinople, the final approach to the imperial territory began. The landscape started to soften. The signs of denser habitation became apparent: more cultivated fields, more secure farms, fewer ruined villages. The great city was drawing them in its gravity, inescapable. Last great stretch of road was wide, paved with huge flat slabs of ancient marble, still relatively well maintained, a silent testament to the enduring power of Rome. The road was built for legions, and now it bore the weight of these new armies of faith. The sight of the Marmaray finally appearing on the horizon was a powerful emotional memento. Shimmer of brilliant blue far beyond the dusty brown hills meant they had crossed the width of the peninsula. It meant Constantinople was close. The weary soldiers stopped their rhythmic pace, looking toward the shimmering water, a momentary pause, and the relentless walking. They had covered hundreds of miles of grueling terrain. They had survived the heat, the dust, the lack of water, the suspicion of the locals, and the difficult politics of the emperor. The sea air carried a different smell: saltwater brine. The promise of ships, of new crossings, of another world waiting on the far side of the Bosphorus. They were almost there, at the edge of the known world, the gateway to Asia Minor. The march became slower, now not from exhaustion, but from the sheer bottleneck of converging forces. The separate armies of Godfrey, Bohemond, and Raymond were all moving toward the same goal: the mighty walls of the Golden City. The logistics became a nightmare: thousands of horses, hundreds of carts, tens of thousands of men all funneling into the same few roads. The days were spent managing the traffic, controlling the animals, preventing fights between the different national contingents. The sheer scale of the undertaking was overwhelming, visible now in its totality. At last, one afternoon, the leading scouts reported the sighting. A hush fell over the forward ranks. Then the ripple of sound spread backward. Through the column, a rising tide of murmured awe and disbelief. Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, lay stretched out before them, vast, immense, beyond any city they had ever seen in the modest Western kingdoms, the great triple walls, rose impossibly high, protecting the landside, a silent expression of invincible power minarets. And domes shone gold and white under the pale eastern sunnet, was a vision of wealth and civilization that stunned the rough western nights into temporary silence. They stood there cloaked in dust and exhaustion, gazing at the unbelievable reality of the Golden Horn. The shimmering harbor filled with countless ships. This moment of arrival was the end of the first terrible of walking. It was the beginning of the second, the complex, dangerous negotiation with the Eastern Emperor before they could step across the water and into the holy conflict of the East. The dust settled slowly, very slowly, in the shadow of the great walls. The march had stopped. The walking had ceased for now. Only the waiting remained, the hushed, expectant silence before the final velvet curtain of night fell upon the imperial city. The air was colder, now a hushed velvet lining the stone room. The script on the amber parchment felt dry beneath his fingertips, a history breathing softly from the deep dust. We stand now where the silent record begins, where the ancient sorrow of the old world clings to the inkreks. Lifted the heavy cylinder closer to the faint spill of moonlight filtering through the high narrow slit above. He did not need to light his oil lamp. The words glowed faintly with an inner warmth, a residue of some forgotten fire or ancient power. They spoke of Aethelred the silent, the king cloaked in mist, a monarch who ruled not by steel but by stillness. His citadel was carved deep into the mountainside, a place of gray weathered stone, eternally damp, forever shielded from the harsh summer sun. The text etched itself into the mind, slow, steady, mesmerizing. Knew the secret language of the river stones. He understood the movement of the moon's shadow across the high moorland grass. His palace was named Khazad-dûm, the Hall of Whispers. It was said that when Ethelred walked the echoing corridors, his own footfalls made no sound, only the slow, persistent drip of subterranean water marked the passage of time. Imagine the high ceilings arching above you, built by masons whose knowledge has vanished entirely. The great hall stretched for hundreds of paces, lined with colossal pillars of black basalt, smooth, cold, unyielding. Each pillar bore the weight of history and the immense silence of the mountain itself. There were no windows in Khazad-dûm, only torchlight or the brief flashes of silver light reflected from the deep underground pools. The world outside was rumor and myth to the people who served the silent king. They lived their lives in perpetual twilight, a soft gray existence marked only by the rhythm of the king's slow movements. The parchment detailed the king's great obsession, not gold, not conquest, not glory, but preservation. Ethelred believed that the moment something was spoken, it began to die. The word vanished into the air, the memory softened, the truth became fluid. He sought to capture the purest essence of the world before the memory failed, so he commissioned the scribes of the unspoken word. These were not ordinary men and women. They were chosen for their inner stillness, their capacity for absolute absorption. They wrote not with ink, but with finely ground mica mixed with the dew collected at dawn from the sacred thorn bushes. Their tablets were thin sheets of polished cedar, preserved with ancient sap and wrapped in velvet. They recorded the light of the morning sun as it struck the eastern wall. They recorded the exact pattern of ripples made by the wind on the cistern water. At noon, they recorded the sound of a spider spinning its web in the darkest corner of the treasury, a record of pure being stripped of interpretation or meaning. The purpose was to create a perfect archive, a mirror held up to existence. Itself, Rex traced the flowing lines of the script, the soft pressure leaving a trail of the fine cave dust on his finger. The story was unfolding too slowly, like deep river silt settling over millennia. He could feel the weight of this forgotten civilization pressing down upon the small chamber where he sat. The air seemed to thicken with the scent of aged wood and mineral. The story shifted then away from Ethelred's architectural genius and toward a specific night. The night of the Ember Stain. It was the 5th year of the silent reign. The citadel was calm. The scribes were working in their hushed cells. A silence deeper than usual had descended upon Khazad-dûm. Sound of dripping water ceased. The faint echo of distant servants faded entirely. Total and absolute cessation of sound. Ethelred was sleeping in his private chamber, a room Lined entirely with black slate meant to absorb all ambient noise, he awoke to find a single shaft of light piercing the darkness of his vault. It was not the moon, not a torch, not anything recognizable. It was an amber light, soft yet piercing, it seemed. To bleed directly from the stone wall itself, the light was warm but did not burn it, was silent but demanded attention. King rose slowly, his velvet robes rustling against the cold stone floor. He approached the wall where the light pulsed it spread, slowly growing like a slow-moving stain across the smooth, dark surface, and within that amber glow something moved. The parchment described it only as a ripple, a hesitation, and the like. Was neither form nor figure yet. It suggested immense dimension. It suggested distance vast and incomprehensible. The king watched not for minutes, but for hours, until the light began to fade with the coming of the true dawn. When the sunlight finally reached the high ventilation slits, the amber stain receded back into the stone it left behind. Only a strange residue, a heatless scar on the cool slate, and a terrible understanding in the mind of the king. The scribes were summoned, but Ethelred forbade them from writing down what he had seen. He told them that this event belonged only to the air, that to fix it in matter would be to invite ruin. It was the one truth too immense, too fragile to be contained by the meticulous records of Khazad. Dwam, the silent king, now carried a silent secret, a knowledge that weighed more heavily than his crown of wrought iron. Scroll continued listing the effects of the amber stain. The light had brought with it a profound shift in the stability of the citadel. The very stone became sensitive, reactive. The scribes began to hear things when they wrote, soft whispering sounds emanating from the bedrock deep below. Human voices, not the wind sounds. Like the turning of colossal gears, sounds like distant waves breaking on a shore that did not exist. The atmosphere became heavy, thick with anticipation. The people of Khazad-dûm began to dream vividly of mountains dissolving into water. They dreamed of the stars rearranging themselves into frightening new constellations. The meticulous order that Ethelred had sought to create began to unravel slowly, subtly. The king grew weary, tormented by the image of that rippling amber light. He knew the citadel was failing, not structurally, but metaphysically. Effort to preserve every single moment had inadvertently drawn the attention of something beyond the moment, something ancient and immensely patient. The scroll then focused on one particular scribe named Lyra. Liren was the most dedicated of them all. He spent 20 years recording only the sound of air moving over polished bronze, a study in pure emptiness. One morning, Liran failed to appear for the daily inspection. His cell was empty. His small cedar tablet was found lying on his sleeping mat. It was blank, but carved crudely into the black slate wall behind the mat was a single new glyph. It was not of the known language of Aetherid's kingdom. It was an angled symbol, complex, yet starkly simple. It looked like 3 lines of lightning crossing a perfect circle. Beneath it, etched even deeper into the stone, was one single word. Echorex paused his reading, the candlelight flickering weakly on the rock floor. He realized the scroll did not describe the king's reaction to this disappearance. It described only the glyph. The focus remained obsessively on the thing itself, the symbol, the intrusion. He ran his thumb over the text describing Liran's fate. The script here felt different, heavier, denser. It suggested a sudden break, a narrative rupture. Felt a sudden wave of cold dread wash over him. This was not a historical record of events. This was a warning woven into the past, a code designed to be found. Leaned back against the cool stone wall, letting the scroll rest on his knees. The history of Ethelred and the Silent King was merely the velvet casing. The true core was the amber stain and the symbol of the echo. He closed his eyes, trying to visualize the deep mountain fortress, the black basalt columns. The silence so profound it was almost visible. He could almost smell the wet stone and the mica dust. The sheer scope of Ethelred's dedication to silence was dizzying. Rex opened his eyes and resumed his focus on the final of the first panel of the scroll. It detailed Ethelred's final command. Seeing the inevitable collapse, the king ordered the citadel sealed, not sealed against invaders, sealed against sound. All entranceways were stopped with solid granite blocks 30 feet thick. The ventilation shafts were choked with tightly packed earth and obsidian shards. The people were to remain inside, suspended In that engineered silence waiting for the end of the world outside, or the end of the silence within, Ethel knew the glyph of the echo was a key. It was the signature of the thing that had caused the amber stain, and he ordered that the tablet containing the story of the stain be hidden far away from Khazad-dûm, hidden in a place of great natural noise, place where water rushed endlessly over jagged stone, place where the wind howled through high peaks, deliberate counterpoint to the absolute stillness of the citadel. The text described the journey of the messenger carrying the scroll, a solitary rider cloaked in heavy black felt moving under the cover of a perpetual gray rain. He traveled for 90 nights toward the edge of the known world where the great gorges cut through the bedrock. He traveled toward the roaring cataract, the place where this very text must have been entombed. Rex felt the air in the chamber grow very still. He looked up at the smooth high ceiling of the cavern he now occupied. Was this the place of noise, the roaring cataract? The chamber was utterly silent save for his own quiet breathing. The king's plan seemed to have failed in that regard. The noise was gone, absorbed by time or trapped somehow. Within the very walls of the gorge, Rex looked down at the parchment. The final etched lines of the panel were tiny, delicate, almost microscopic. They were written in a different hand altogether, not the flowing, elegant script of the scribes of the unspoken word. The script was frantic, jagged, almost terrified. It described the messenger's arrival at the place of the cataract. He found not the roar of water. He found only a hushed mist rising from the gorge floor. The water was gone, the stone dry, the great noise swallowed, and then the final chilling lines. The messenger saw a solitary figure standing at the edge of the chasm, cloaked in gray rags, facing away from the messenger. He held a staff of polished cedar, and he was drawing something in the dust. With the tip of his staff, the messenger drew nearer silently, carefully. The figure looked up not with surprise, not with fear, but with quiet expectation. And the messenger saw his face. It was Liranthe, missing scribe of the unspoken word, but his eyes were no longer recording silence. His eyes were filled with the rippling amber light, and he did not speak a single word. He simply lifted the staff and pointed not into the chasm, but back toward the west, toward Khazad-dûm. Was left unfinished, smeared into the amber parchment by a tremor of the messenger's hand. Word was returned. Rex felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Realized the silence in this chamber was too perfect, too heavy. The air felt like old glass, fragile and waiting to shatter. He listened intently the sounds of the outside world, the distant calls of night birds, the movement of the wind. Nothing penetrated the deep stone. He reached out, slowly touching the rough cavern wall beside him. Felt unnaturally smooth here, almost polished, and as his hand brushed the stone surface, he felt a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, a vibration that seemed to come not from the earth, but from the very composition of the rock itself. It was a deep, slow hum beneath the surface of the silence. Rex drew his hand back quickly, his heart beginning a faster, slower rhythm. He stared into the darkness beyond the reach of the moonlight. The king had wanted the scroll hidden in noise. It was found in silence, and now the silence held a deep, soft hum. The sound was growing barely perceptible, yet persistent-like the turning of colossal gears far, far below the bedrock. He slowly rolled the amber parchment back into its ancient cylinder. Symbol of the Echo Liran? The amber stain, the secret history, had found its recipient, and now the history was beginning to move. Rex listened to the hushed vibration that grew stronger in the cool air. Was not alone in the immense stone chamber. The silence was breathing now, and something cloaked in deep shadow was waiting at the edge of the moonlight. The dust never settled. It simply hung a low ochre blanket, always drifting just above the moving column. It was the color of tired clay, the texture of ground bone, a fine powder. That permeated every thread of woolen tunic, every crack in dry skin, every lung gasping for clean air. They breathed the march. They wore the march. They tasted the ancient grit of a continent under their tongues day after slow day. Sun was their constant tormentor, a blazing shield of white light overhead, pouring down amber fury on bent necks and sweat-soaked leather. No shadow offered true relief, only a momentary dimming. As they passed the rare outcrop of sun-baked rock or the stunted thorny scrub that clung desperately to the desolate slope, this was the interior, far from the rumored green coast, far from the easy pathways, now only the relentless climb the shallow descent, and the level waste stretched endlessly before them. Sound of their passage was not thunderous. It was grinding a dull, perpetual murmur of thousands of feet, shuffling thousands of hooves, churning the earth. Into finer dust leather squeaked. Against leather, chainmail shifted with a whispered rustle. Wood shafts knocked softly against shield rims. This sound was the true measure of time, not the sun's arc, but the rhythmic grind, the inevitable friction. The sound of duty performed endlessly. Nights once bright with purpose now wore cloaks of fatigue. Their surcoats designed to flash piety and power were now faded, blotched with brine and stained with the rusty residue of their own sweat. Their helms were furnaces, their voices cracked, and low, reserved only for the necessary instruction or the hushed prayer, muttered into the furnace heat. Arnulf strode near the center of the column, his eyes fixed on the heel of the man in front of him, a brown patch of hardened skin where the boot had worn through. He counted his steps, not consciously, but his body measured them. 400 steps between water breaks, 800 steps before the sun reached its zenith. 5,000 steps until the evening cold might kiss his brow. It were slow, heavy. Like stones rolling uphill, he no longer remembered the exact dimensions of his village house, only the feeling of the cool stone floor against his bare feet on a winter morning. He remembered the smell of the hearth smoke, that rich peat smell. This thin, acrid sting of dry grass, burning memory itself, was becoming bleached by the sun, becoming as dusty and uncertain as the path ahead sometimes. In the suffocating heat, the distant hills would shimmer and dissolve into lakes of phantom water. A cruel mirage shimmering just out of reach. The men knew it was illusion, but still their parched eyes lingered, hoping against hope for the sight of silver water cool enough to truly quench the deep thirst that lived permanently in their bones. Days were a repetition of thirst, of muscle ache, of the dull throbbing pain behind eyes, caused by endless squinting into the glare. The nights offered a brief, dangerous mercy as the sun sank abruptly, turning the sky an unbelievable shade of velvet. Crimson and bruised purple, the air cooled quickly. The army halted, the thousands settling. Like a massive weary beast sighing and collapsing onto the hard ground fires were tiny islands of uncertain light, small yellow beacons, swallowed by the encompassing blackness of the eastern night. The men ate sparingly hard biscuit, dipped in weak broth, maybe a sliver of dried mutton if the supply lines had held that day. Spoke little, their voices exhausted, their conversations reduced to essentials. Where is the water? Is the guard set? How much further is the next settlement? The camp noise was not chaotic. It was hushed, low, subdued. Sounds were the metallic sigh of armor being shed, the low murmur of prayers offered to a distant, uninterested God. The heavy breathing of sleep overtaking the weary, and under the immense spread of the ancient sky, the stars burned with terrifying clarity. They were endless cold pinpricks of white light stretching across the black velvet cloak above them, reminding every man how impossibly small they were, how far from home, how fragile their purpose. Arnulf would lie back, using his shield as a pillow, the cold metal transferring the chill of the earth into his skull, a welcomed shock. He would watch the star field, spinning slowly above the ridge of the mountains, etched against the dark. He imagined those stars were the eyes of ancestors, the eyes of saints watching their terrible, slow progress. He wondered if they judged the speed of their march, if they sighed at the slowness of human feet. The discipline was the only thing holding them together. Discipline was the harness that kept the beast of despair leashed. If one man broke, if one unit scattered, the entire colossal effort risked disintegration. So they rose before the first pale wash of dawn, before the sun had begun its daily ascent. Heralds moved through the camp, their voices rough and muffled, calling the men to wakefulness, calling them back to the dust. Chill of the pre-dawn air bit into their exposed skin for a moment, the cold felt cleansing a brief reset before the day's inevitable heat began its work. The process of arming was slow, stiff-jointed. Straps were pulled, tight buckles, secured steel, settled back onto exhausted shoulders. Smell of wood smoke mixed with the sharp odor of horse sweat and the metallic tang of unwashed bodies. Breakfast was a quick ration. A few swallows of sour wine or water, if there was any left, and then the trumpets sounded not a joyous call, but a necessary signal, a sound of grim inevitability. The column reformed, stretching out into a long serpent of steel and wool and dust. They walked. East, always east. The geography shifted slightly day by day. The low scrub gave way to regions of hard, dry clay cracked. Like ancient pottery, the earth refusing to yield any moisture. Then they would enter low hills where the rock was fractured basalt, sharp underfoot threatening to ruin the already worn boots. The horses suffered terribly, their hooves cracking, their flanks rubbed raw, their heads drooping with fatigue. Night without a horse was still a night, but his status changed, his mobility vanished. He became afoot, bound to the pace of the infantry, carrying the burden of his ancient steel. They passed through villages. Sometimes these settlements were meager, often deserted, the locals having fled the approach of the giant, hungry army. When the villages were present, the exchange was tense, quick, transactional. The Crusaders needed grain, water, fodder. The villagers needed peace and feared the army's unchecked appetite. There were often disagreements, sometimes skirmishes, sometimes brief, brutal acts of looting disguised as necessity. Leaders Bohemond and Godfrey and Raymond worked tirelessly to maintain order, to ensure that the march did not turn into a roving bandit army. But exhaustion bred cruelty, and hunger was a relentless master. Men saw themselves as instruments of divine will, immune to common law, the journey itself sanctifying. Their every transgression, they justified their actions with the endless mantra, God wills it, Dios will. They whispered the words into the dust, their voices raw. They needed to believe they were exceptional, otherwise the sheer monotony of the physical suffering made no sense. The journey was not a glorious campaign, it was simply walking, relentless, tedious walking. There were no epic battles, only the daily struggle against the weight of the hauberk and the distance to the next landmark, a single oddly shaped stone or a distant dead tree etched against the sky. Arnulf thought of the weight of his mail shirt. It was 70 pounds of cold iron links, forged to protect him, yet now it felt like a sentence, a perpetual drag on his strength. He imagined the life of a peasant, walking only to his fields, walking only to the market, the gentle pace of a life, defined by seasons, not by hostile leagues. He tried to focus on the immediate sensation, the feel of the sword, hilt against his palm, slick with sweat, the subtle sway of the scabbard knocking against his thigh. Tried to keep his mind locked only on the now, the next step, the next breath, the next hour. To look too far ahead was paralyzing. To look too far back was agonizing. He had been marching for months now. The seasons had changed 3 times since they left the familiar forests of France. Leaves had turned to amber and fallen. They had seen the brief, cruel wet of winter, and now they were deep into the baking sun of the high summer, approaching the gates of a land they only knew through scripture. They walked through history itself, a deep stone-etched land where empires rose and crumbled beneath their weary feet. They were marching across ground trod by Alexander, by Roman legions, by countless forgotten tribes. The dust beneath their boots held the powdered remains of millennia of conflict, of pilgrimage, of simple human existence. It was humbling and terrifying, this sense of ancient continuity. The air grew thin and dry, the silence between the men deepened. They communicated less with words, more with glances, with the shared rhythm of their fatigue. When one man stumbled, 2 others would instinctively reach out a hand, steadying the link in the chain. They were bound together by their shared misery, by the single overriding purpose to reach the holy city. It was the fixed point on their mental compass, the star. They sailed by Jerusalem, Jerusalem. The whispered name was a talisman against despair, a velvet promise hidden within the hard shell of the days. Suffering it was the imagined sight of the golden domes, the cool shade of the olive groves, the scent of frankincense and sanctity that pulled them forward. One heavy footfall after another, they came to a riverbed dry and cracked a vast wound in the earth. It spoke of a long-lost torrent, a powerful flood that had vanished, leaving only the memory of water. Inscribed in the deep silt, they crossed it slowly, the horses stumbling over the large rounded stones that lined the channel. It was a stark symbol of their current state. Dehydrated, emptied, waiting for the deluge that might never come. Sun began its slow decline, sinking toward the western horizon. The way they